Now, I've been criticizing guidelines for probably 15 years now. I recognized when they first came out that these were an abomination, and I started criticizing them, and I received nothing but condemnation from within the academic community. And I was able to participate over the years in many debates, and at least according to me, I won every one of them. There's just no question about it. But so why do we criticize? Why did I criticize guidelines? Why did I pick on this? And I think the main reason was that outsiders from the profession can hold us accountable to our own guidelines. And they can, by taking our professional authority, turn them around and create an enforceable standard. And then everybody sort of has to follow that standard. And this is why it's a problem. If we were to just look at the guidelines ourselves as physicians with the understanding that they were what they say they are, guidelines and not mandates, that it wouldn't be as harmful. But they are harmful because of this. This is actually from an AAPS newsletter from quite a few years ago. And as Twyla Braze mentioned yesterday, you make a mistake in your office, you call the patient up and you bring them back in and you take care of it. If you get a guideline wrong, you can harm thousands of patients. And this is what is happening. There's just no question about it. And I'll give you a very clear example of how a huge guideline in nephrology has really led to great harm. And this idea that there is a standard of care, and this has become a mantra of the evidence-based medicine crowd, that there is one good way, one best way to practice medicine. And this is, of course, ridiculous and has never been proven. So what is wrong with them? Well, they're so difficult to produce that by the time they're actually published, they're invariably obsolete. They are almost completely opinion-based. Even when they call upon evidence, they're biased in what evidence they pick. The evidence itself is likely to be biased. They're very prescriptive. They're actually telling you who to give what to when. They're very often, in fact, almost always, industry-funded. In fact, if industry didn't exist, these guidelines would not exist. It used to be, you heard from Dr. Woofter yesterday, you know, the rep would come in, they'd wine and dine you maybe, they'd take you out to play golf or tennis, get you tickets to the basketball game, and they'd find other ways to influence your prescribing behavior. That was much more honest, frankly, in those days. Can we get to some, you're okay? That was much more honest than what we have now, which is this backdoor manipulation of our prescribing pen through this whole guideline process. So industry funds these guidelines, and they also have a say in who gets to be on the panels. And that is crucial because they have on the panel heavily funded people through various speaking contracts and consulting deals and research funding. So the authors are biased. And so the guidelines have never been tested. They're just put out there, and everybody's expected to take them on faith, but they've never been put to the test, let's say, comparing guideline or standardized care versus individualized care. They use targets for different things, such as hemoglobin, which we'll talk about later, or hemoglobin A1C in diabetes, or cholesterol level, LDL cholesterol level, blood pressure targets. These targets encourage you to just treat and treat and treat until you get to some number. And it takes your eye off of the individual patient and often leads to overtreatment and harm. And it discourages creative thinking and research. In fact, when a drug company, let's say, gets a guideline that they like, research in that area stops. Okay, there's no longer any incentive for them to put out a study that might contradict the favorable guideline they already got. And the evidence, as you'll see, is very poor. One of the gurus in this area is John Ioannidis from Greece, who is a fabulously interesting writer, and he has led the charge to sort of demystify and debunk a lot of what has become, unfortunately, in medicine and in science in general, but in medicine particularly, junk science. And what he has shown is that for most study designs, it is more likely for a research claim to be false. Claimed research findings may be simply accurate measures of prevailing bias. The greater the financial and other interests and prejudices, the less likely the research findings are to be true. So the bias in medical research in particular is tremendously obvious. I'm going to quote now some liberally from the book that I mentioned yesterday and that Twyla also quoted from, Tarnished Gold, The Sickness of EBM. I recommend it highly. It's a fun book to get through. There are some parts that slow you down a little bit, but by and large, it is really good. And so they say that evidence-based medicine was introduced in about 1991. This is a recent phenomenon. Most of us went to medical school before the days of evidence-based medicine and learned real medicine, which is based on inductive reasoning and Bayesian Bayes' theorem. Supporters declared it as a new paradigm and a major advance. They claimed the ideal way of making decisions about patients involves selective use of the best evidence from large-scale studies. Since 2001, EBM has been on its way to replacing traditional medicine, which depended on understanding physiology and disease processes. Basic science and clinical experience were relegated to the lower divisions of medical evidence. Evidence-based medicine enjoys considerable support from corporate medicine, governments, and the medical establishment. It is of particular use to such organizations, and its statistical approach provides a legal framework that aids the management and governance of medicine. EBM supports the medical industries in offering a structure for the development and introduction of new drugs and treatments. Their particular claim of being evidence-based seems to imply that other forms of medicine rest on the shifting sands of prejudice and intuition. So, as Twyla said yesterday, it's all about the language. Medicine should be a practical discipline based on scientific observation and experiment. There is only one valid form of medicine which must be based on science. Anything else is quackery. So what is EBM? According to a widely quoted definition, EBM is the conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about the care of individual patients. In the context of scientific medicine, there is no such thing as best evidence, there is only information. All information is potentially useful, and until you know the answer, it is prudent not to pre-select which evidence you think will be best. This is very basic scientific logic. EBM is based on a statistical blunder, the assumption that a population value can be applied to one specific individual. This is known as the ecological fallacy. It is fundamentally incorrect to apply the results of large-scale trials to individual patients. Despite this, the EBM myth is that individual patients should be treated according to a gold standard of population statistics. A doctor needs to treat every patient as a person with a unique problem. A doctor practicing purely according to statistical expectations will inevitably harm patients. Just a few more of these. They're so good, I had to really pick and choose what I was going to quote from this book. Medical problems are too complex for doctors to be able to follow a list of instructions. They need to apply judgment. In practice, the problems faced by an individual doctor are too specific to allow a solution using standard statistical methods. Key points. The variety in a group of individuals greatly exceeds that of the statistics used to describe them. And Twyla gave you the example of the average height. It doesn't tell you anything about the height of individuals in that group. The same is true of all these large-scale studies. This is a critical failure. Trying to apply group medical statistics to an individual patient not only results in the ecological fallacy and breaks Ashby's law, it does not provide an adequate model. So it gives you a flavor for how they get into this whole thing. EBM is based on epidemiology, the study of disease in populations. The illnesses a population suffers from change over time, so EBM is always out of date. The hugely expensive scale of EBM trials means that drug companies have a near monopoly on research. Only potentially profitable treatments, mainly those that can be patented, are pursued, and we know that this is true. EBM creates a reductionist, rule-based approach to medicine. The freedom of doctors to treat their patients is inevitably compromised. The data is incomplete. Corporate medicine publishes results that help profits and suppress any negative findings. The literature itself is biased. This is clearly true. Okay, there's no need for, and there's no requirement that companies publish studies that are unfavorable, and they don't. By extending existing ideas of chronic disease, more drugs can be sold. The result is an increasingly medicated population. This is from an article by Spence in the BMJ. Statistics are used to manipulate results. Many doctors are not highly trained in statistics, so are vulnerable to being deliberately misled by disreputable analysis. The design of clinical trials and related studies is biased. Results from high-risk groups are used to market drugs to low-risk groups. And we see this all the time in terms of the statins, for example. So this is from a colleague of mine in the nephrology world, Dan Coyne, who's also a foe of the guideline process. And he says that these observational analyses that the guidelines are often based on can promote a circular logic, such as different targets for albumin, hemoglobin, let's say, and then you label these goals as intermediate outcomes for better survival because they have been linked to better survival in purely observational studies. Then you perform an association studies with these goals with survival, and you show that lo and behold, that the people who reach these targets do better, and then you conclude from this that the guideline recommendations are correct. But this is completely circular reasoning. Now, what about anemia? Well, the treatment of anemia in end-stage renal disease, something that I've been very closely linked to and affiliated with for really all of my career. Anemia in end-stage renal disease was a huge problem. Patients had to be transfused often. They developed iron overload. It was quite a mess, and they were quite symptomatic. So when in '89, thereabouts, two companies were racing to get their drug out to the market first, Chugai in Japan and Amgen, tiny biotech company in the United States, both came out with a technique to make this recombinant form of erythropoietin. And Amgen won the patent war, and they became dominant. And they went from this tiny biotech company to a major, $40 billion company. And they took on, unfortunately, all of the aspects of what I consider to be bad big pharma over the years. So when hemoglobin levels, when EPO came out, as it's called, it was widely hailed. We all jumped on the bandwagon and we were prescribing it like crazy. There was this euphoria. We finally had this drug and everybody was along for the ride. And Amgen was sort of pushing us along with their ways of getting us to prescribe lots of this drug. And one of the ways they did this was they called into existence a group initially called KDOQI for Dialysis Outcome Quality Initiative, and then later rebranded as KDOQI for Kidney Disease Outcome Quality Initiative. They created this out of nothing by giving the National Kidney Foundation a huge grant, many millions of dollars. So NKF became a sort of a sponsor, was sponsored by Amgen to produce guidelines. And the intent of the guidelines was largely to establish dosing parameters for EPO, which was, of course, their major drug at that time, their only drug really at that time. So they had several different versions of these over the years, but they used observational studies to recommend that the hemoglobin in dialysis patients should be in the 11 to 12 grams per deciliter range and not greater than 13. And these were all based on purely observational studies. And when you think about it, it didn't really make any sense that treating these numbers would improve patients' outcome because mild anemia, let's say a hemoglobin of 10 or 9 even, is not fatal. You could have that kind of an anemia and live a totally long, normal life. So this was a guideline that came out in 2006, which was an adjustment upward towards 13, of an upper limit of 13. So the hemoglobin should be always greater than 11, but not greater than 13, but they acknowledged that a 13 was reasonable in a pre-dialysis measurement. And keep that in mind, we're measuring the hemoglobin at its lowest possible point when the patients are volume overloaded and their hemoglobin is diluted down. So this recommendation ignored a study that had been done by a friend of ours, Tony Bessarab, in 1998 called the Normal Hematocrit Trial, looking at 1,200 hemodialysis patients who had heart disease and who were given EPO to reach a normal hematocrit level of 42 or the original old level of 30. The study was stopped early due to an increased access thrombosis rate and cardiovascular risk in the higher hematocrit group. And there were more deaths and more non-fatal MIs. It did not reach quite statistical significance, but it was enough for them to realize they were not going to get a positive result out of the study, and they stopped it. Then, in 2006, months after those updated guidelines came out, two studies appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, the QUIRE and the CREATE study, both looking at pre-dialysis and not quite end-stage renal disease patients, chronic kidney disease patients, being treated to different hemoglobin targets. And the QUIRE study done in the United States showed that the patients who were in the higher target group had a higher increased risk of reaching the composite endpoint of death, MI, hospitalization for CHF and stroke, 125 versus 97 events. They stopped this study early because it was so bad for them. The CREATE study was not stopped early. This was done in Europe using lower doses of EPO, or actually Procrit over there, I believe, and the same drug, really. Looking at similar targets, 13 to 15 versus 10.5 to 11.5, and there was no benefit in the higher group, though they required dialysis faster and then had more cardiovascular events. So no benefit plus harm. This was the result in the CHOIR study by Ajay Singh, showing the increased risk of death, stroke, MI, and CHF. So immediately upon release of these papers in the New England Journal, there was a media firestorm, and largely because Ajay Singh, the author of the CHOIR study, had gone to the media because he had tried to get the guideline group to back off from their increasing the hemoglobin targets, and they ignored him. So he got very upset. He's a mild-mannered guy. He's not, a shaker, but he called the press conferences, and they went kind of ballistic over this. So this article appeared in the Wall Street Journal showing how research questioned these aggressive treatment guidelines from the KDOQI group. As a matter of fact, they there was an editorial that was supposed to accompany the articles in the New England Journal of Medicine that mentioned the industry connection. For example, that the National Kidney Foundation was getting $4 million a year from Amgen and $3.6 million from Orthobiotech, which made Procrit, which is the same drug as EPO. So this editorial was not published in the New England Journal. In fact, a rather bland editorial by an NKF officer, Julie Engelfinger, was published in its stead. But this, of course, ultimately came out. I think The Lancet published it. So they then changed the guidelines slightly, but didn't really adjust the range. It still was 11 to 13. Then when was this? A couple of years ago, really, 2010 or so, 11, the TREAT study came out, which was a study of diabetic patients who were not on dialysis but had chronic kidney disease. And this was really the first placebo-controlled trial of erythropoietin-stimulating agent versus placebo. So they targeted a goal of 13 using Aranesp, which was a modified version of EPO that Amgen produced. And lo and behold, and the other group was maintained at a hemoglobin, say around 9 and 10 with occasional transfusion. And lo and behold, the treatment group did much worse. They had a significantly increased risk of stroke. So here is a very good example of a guideline being pushed by industry. The industry panelists, the panelists who wrote these guidelines, almost all of them had contracts of one sort or another with Amgen. So it was clear how this was going to play out. Now, we have also looked at this effect of volume overload on the hemoglobin. I mean, it's kind of ludicrous that we're even looking at pre-dialysis hemoglobin in these patients because they're all artificially low due to volume expansion. And when we looked at this in a large population of dialysis patients, we found that the hemoglobin levels decreased along with indicators of volume overload. And also the EPO dosing went up. So we were dosing these patients inappropriately based on false data that didn't really reflect the patient's true hemoglobin. And of course, everybody knew this all along, that this was a problem, but it was more or less brushed under the rug along with a lot of other concerns, along with a lot of help from Amgen with this. So what about conflicts of interest? Well, they are widely prevalent in guideline panels. Okay, Newman study from the BMJ, 14 guidelines published by national organizations in the US and Canada between 2000 and 2010. Over 52% had conflicts, of which 138 were declared and 12 were undeclared. 12 of the 14 panels evaluated identified chairs, among whom 6 had financial conflicts of interest. So you cannot have these academic physicians who I know make very little, who are getting large contracts from industry and not have them be biased. It's simply impossible. So guidelines are dangerous. As I said before, we as doctors and medical professionals can keep these in perspective, but they are being used by payers to limit payment, as Dr. Greenwood is going to explain to you. And also they're going to be incorporated, they are being incorporated into as algorithms into EHRs. And so, you know, when you're using the EHR and Craig Wax is going to tell us how this works, it's sort of like playing a video game, that in order to get to a certain result, you have to press certain buttons, you have to click on certain things. So it programs you to follow an algorithm in order to get the kind of prescription that you want to get out of the patient or something similar. We are being pushed to overprescribe through guidelines. One of the things that the Hickey book, Tarnished Gold, mentioned is a concept, they talk a lot about heuristics, which are, you know, ideas that help you to play games, and they're strategies in a way. And one that is very useful is what they call POSI-WID. The purpose of something is what it does. Okay, it's a very clever way of looking at things in that it cuts through a lot of verbiage and red tape. For example, the purpose of the Obama administration is to dominate the country and transform the United States. You know, you look at what he does, forget about what he says, look at what he does. Well, POSI-WID, what is the purpose of guidelines? The purpose of guidelines is to make doctors prescribe more drugs and more treatments. This is just very clear. This whole process is suspect. I believe it's corrupt. Individual patients are harmed. I mean, it's hard to calculate how many people were harmed by these very ridiculous prescribing recommendations for ESAs, where we had patients who were getting 20,000 units, sometimes 3 times a week, of EPO, when, you know, most people would respond quite well to maybe 3,000 or 4,000 3 times a week. This incentive to get these numbers into a range pushed doctors to prescribe, and a lot of these things were on autopilot, being run by the staff in the dialysis unit. The doctors weren't even aware that these changes were being made. The practice of medicine is undermined. I mean, why study medicine if you can follow guidelines? And you don't really need doctors. Guidelines make doctors obsolete, and in fact, that's really one of the reasons behind them. So we have to try to treat patients individually and reject this whole concept of standardized care. As leaders, we ought to stop creating and publishing guidelines. This is what I tell my colleagues at academic meetings. Stop writing guidelines. I mean, they're just being used against us, but they cannot stop. I mean, they're just addicted to this whole process, right, Roger? I mean, I don't know what it is. Guidelines create this illusion of knowledge. You think you know something because you have a guideline. Well, you don't. We're in the dark about the vast majority of what's happening in medicine and in patients. So I'll leave you with a quote from this great book. EBM encourages totalitarian medicine, and you're going to hear from Diana West this afternoon about totalitarianism. It is displacing the doctor-patient unit as the ultimate decision-making authority. Peer review is used as censorship. EBM is a self-referential closed system where critical appraisal means checking whether a study conforms to its rules. So-called evidence-based medicine wrongly claims the authority of medical and scientific gold standards. There is no such thing as scientific proof, and Twyla also mentioned this. You cannot prove something is true. You can only disprove a truly scientific notion. All treatments are scientifically unproven. EBM repackages and uses concepts from legal proof in an attempt to impose a medical dictatorship. EBM enables corporate medicine to redefine science as a form of advertising. I think that neatly sums it up. So I think that I will stop.